Good afternoon. I'm Rosalind Goldner, Executive Director, Respectful Environments, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the Faculty of Medicine. I'm delighted to welcome you to this special session of our IBPOC Voices series. This series provides an opportunity to hear from members of our community who identify as Indigenous, Black, and people of color. And in this series, guests discuss their personal experiences in finding inclusion and belonging, and how all too prevalent reactions to IBPOC identity, including exclusion, othering, racism, and inequities, present barriers to full participation in the academy and in our community. Their narratives also underscore how identity has helped develop the resilience, strength, and purpose that have helped them overcome these barriers and achieve success. Many of you attending this session today are attending from across the province on traditional unceded territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, I'm in my home office located on the traditional, ancestral, and most importantly, unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish. I'm an immigrant to Canada, and I'm grateful to the life that I and my family enjoy living on this land. As a white immigrant, my largely positive experience is based in part on the unearned privileges and benefits bestowed upon me by accident of birth. The staggering reality for the people of this land is that they have been and continue to be denied their basic human rights as individuals and as Indigenous peoples. My privilege, and the privilege of many of us in the audience today, comes with responsibilities. Responsibilities to learn about the full history of this land, not only through the lens of the oppressors. To hear the truths that Indigenous peoples have been telling about the impact of colonialism on Indigenous individuals and communities. And perhaps more importantly, to commit to the difficult process of reconciliation and to act to do what we can do to ameliorate the ongoing damage of the denial of Indigenous human rights. If those of us with privilege use our privilege responsibly, then we will demonstrate genuine gratitude for being on this land. I want to say that today's event departs from our usual format of engaging a single person in conversation with Dr. Neila, the REDI Anti-Racism Advisor. In recognition of Black History Month, the time to honor and celebrate the diversity, history, and culture of Black people, and the many everyday contributions of Black communities from across the country, we've gathered a panel of extraordinary individuals whose generous participation provides an opportunity for us to meet them and learn more about Black people in our own community. I anticipate that the perspectives and insights shared today will be eye-opening and thought-provoking, particularly for those in our community who are still not prepared to acknowledge that anti-Black racism exists in our community, that it is present in our systems and processes, and in the unconscious biases and attitudes of individuals in our community. Discriminatory attitudes and conduct are barriers to inclusion and to the creation of respectful, anti-racist learning and work environments. They are antithetical to our commitment as a faculty to transform our culture and to recognize, support, and create safe spaces for the exercise of human rights, where all members of our community can experience a sense of belonging. Across the Faculty of Medicine, there are many initiatives underway to support this transformation that we seek and to support our aspirational environments. One initiative I would like to mention is the creation of a Black MD student admissions pathway. Many of the people some of the people anyway on our panel and in our audience participated in the work that went into bringing about this pathway. It's fitting that this month we are conducting interviews in our first admissions cycle for this pathway. I believe the results of this initiative will benefit Black individuals and enhance the medical school experience for the entire next cohort of trainees. Our quest for excellence in our work and learning environments is supported by equity, diversity, and inclusion. I hope that today we will listen to our panelists with open hearts and open minds so that we can learn from their experiences and their thoughts on how they envision a more inclusive environment, and that we will act to fulfill our commitments to all members of our community. This session will include a question and answer period that Dr. Millett will moderate. And now I get the good pleasure of being able to sit back, to listen, and to learn. Thank you, Dr. Millett.
Thank you so much, Rosalind. What a pleasure to be with this panel. What a pleasure to be with these guests. Thank you so much for this introduction, founding us and the framework and how the conversations is going to be going and moving forward. I am Neila, and I am an immigrant settler. And it is a huge privilege and honor to be today moderating this conversation. I would start with a quote of a person I really admire and respect, UBC professor, scholar, director of UBC Center of Culture, Identity and Education, and senior advisor to the President on Anti-Racism and Inclusive Excellence, said in a recent interview, I'm talking about Dr. Handel Wright, part of what we tend to do with history we don't consider significant, like Black history, is put it in a box as something that exists only in the past. To think of Blackness in more than just historical terms. I want people to make connection between the past and the present. Instead of just Black history, we should address Black continuity. With this spirit today, with this spirit framing this session, I am welcoming my guests and welcoming you all for a conversation that opens up hearts and minds, embraces vulnerability and celebrates resistance. A conversation that centers Black voices, Black lives, Black experiences, and Black hopes. Today, I'm honored and I'm humbled to moderate this conversation with my guests. They are all members of the Faculty of Medicine. I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Felix Durity. Dr. Felix Durity is a retired neurosurgeon and a former UBC professor who was the first neurosurgical trainee in Western Canada. He was awarded the Order of BC for his efforts as establishing centers of excellence in neurosurgery in BC and in Ghana, as well as being the founding member of the Trauma Association of Canada. Since retiring, he has been actively involved in social justice causes in Africa, BC, and elsewhere. He is currently working to address underrepresentation in the faculty at all levels of the Indigenous, Black, and people of color. Hi, Dr. Felix.
Good morning, afternoon.
GB is a fourth-year medical student at the University of British Columbia and was the inaugural chair of the Black Medical Students Association of Canada. He is a queer Black immigrant from Nigeria with a keen interest in health access and equity for marginalized people, and has been involved in interdisciplinary advocacy and research work prior to medical school. Currently, he continues his advocacy work on various EDI advocacy groups for the Faculty of Medicine, as a chair of the BMSAC Research Committee, and as the undergraduate representative for the Black physicians of BC. Hi, GB. Thank you so much
for having me.
Being my guest. Thank you. Dr. Tatiana Sotindjo, I hope I'm saying the name correctly, is part of the pediatric care team at the Provincial HIV Care Program and consultant adolescent medicine specialist at BC Children's Youth Health Clinic. She's also the inaugural Hudson Scholar for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for the UBC Department of Paediatrics. She's a leader in equity, diversity, and inclusion in her clinical work and advocates tirelessly for patients and staff facing racism and discrimination. It's a great pleasure to have you with us, Tatiana.
Likewise, thank you.
Donneil McNab is a Black settler from Jamaica who is a Black Student Initiatives Manager In the MD undergraduate program, she's passionate about providing specialized support for racialized students at the post-secondary level and collaborating with relevant stakeholders to address systemic barriers that impede development and access in education and other sectors. Donneil focuses on building communities among equity-deserving groups by creating, sustaining, safe and inclusive platforms for intersectional storytelling. Great to be with us, Donneil. Thank you so much for being our guest. Our guest is Dr. Michael Schwandt. Michael is a specialist physician in public health and preventive medicine. He practices as a medical health officer with Vancouver Coastal Health and is a clinical assistant professor. In the UBC Faculty of Medicine, he works with health system and government partners to control communicable diseases, protect communities from environmental hazards, and promote health at the population level. He promotes action for anti-racism and equity in public health and is a proud descendant of emancipated Trinidadian and Barbadian people. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael. Thank you all for being with us today. And we are all looking forward to your experiences, expertise, and opinions. I start the conversation with the questions that aims to attend to the differentiated experiences of Black people. When I ask this question, I have the Nigerian Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and since we have a GB with us, reminding him of the homeland, Adichie that the single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with the stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. I hope that this conversation is going to build that sense that Blackness, Black experiences, Black identities is so varied and differentiated. My first question to my guests is, how does it feel being Black in BC and Canada? I probe on that and say, how did you get the consciousness around your race as a Black person? The floor is yours. So.
I'll lead off if I may. So very quickly, I'll set the background. I was born and raised in Trinidad, in the West Indies, which is a small island off the coast of South America. The population was only 1.3 to 1.4 million people, but out of those 1.4 million people, about 40% what I guess they will now call themselves Afro-Trinidadians. They were people that look very much like me in varying shades. There was a significant 33% that were East Indian, and the rest was scattered among some Asians, a few whites, and so on. So I grew up in a system where we were not the minority, we were the majority. And as a result of that, I grew up knowing I was Black, obviously, but never carrying it as a cross on my back. When I came to Canada as a young student to join UBC, it became very clear that indeed I was a minority. But I was blessed. I came in the late 50s, and I was blessed to be embraced by a small Trinidad community that was already here. And so I had a support system that recognized that we were Trinidadians, we were Black, but we would function in a protected environment. And I must say my experience in UBC which was only 5,000 students then, in the Faculty of Medicine, where I was one of 7 Trinidadian students in a class of 60, in a residency program that had not many, but 2 Black trainees out of 9, and the other one was from Ethiopia, and he's gone on to an amazing career in thing, and I went on to become head of neurosurgery. I was never, ever made to be aware, quote unquote, of my Blackness as a barrier. And it is only in the latter years, after I went to places like Ghana and so on and came back, that I began to realize how disadvantaged Blacks were, particularly those who were born in Canada, within the Canadian context of history. So I have become sensitized to my Blackness in a way that I was not before. And as a result of that, I'm clearly an advocate. So my experience in Canada was a very, 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 very benign one. I was supported throughout by people of all colors and races. Opportunities were never denied me. And that is an experience that is far right or left, depending on your point of what the current experience is.
I would go, thank you so much, Felix. Please, Tatiana, I see you on unmute, so would you please let us know about your own experiences around that consciousness around race?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in traditional unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory, also known as Ottawa. And like some of the children that I care for, I was a transracial adoptee. So even within my nuclear family, I was very early aware that I didn't look like the majority of the individuals around me. And I think that although that was something that I came to conclusion pretty early on in life, and like many children do, far before any adult began talking to me about race or issues of race. I then was privileged enough to do my education from elementary straight through into medical school in French, because it is my maternal ancestral, one of my maternal and ancestral languages. And I became part of the kind of Francophone diaspora. I would say that in medical school, I was lucky enough to be in a cohort that had other individuals of African, Caribbean, and Black descent. However, when I did transition onto residency, I was the only one in my cohort. And overall, I think it was a very positive experience. When I became aware of more intrinsic anti-Blackness within the healthcare system or within medicine itself was my first experiences on the wards of being sought out by ACB individuals, or people turning to me when there were issues of racisms that were occurring or had already occurred and things were going sideways. And then when I realized very much when I was in South Africa for electives, that there were many things, basic things that I didn't know about the care of people with highly melanated skin, for example, that I hadn't been taught in my medical training here. And I had the privilege of learning more in depth when I was out of country. So those are some of the sentinel experiences that I had that made me aware of my Blackness, both from an academic, clinical, and personal experience.
Thank you, Tatiana. Would like to hear from GB how that experience is similar, different from yours, that consciousness that we acquire.
Yeah, absolutely. I do resonate with a lot that Felix and Tatiana have said. I was born in Nigeria. I was raised in Nigeria and moved to Canada when I was 16. I came with a lot of privilege, and that's a reality for a lot of continental African immigrants because of the way Canadian immigration works. You often have to show you have a certain amount of money or are of a certain status to come to Canada and be quote unquote, useful to the country economically anyway. So I did come with a lot of privilege, and my experience I started to notice was different than those who were born and raised in Canada. I worked with international students in student affairs before medical school, and I could see the differences between the experiences of the students and how they navigated the world around them. And that curiosity is sort of what made me more aware of my Blackness. I really wasn't Black in my mind until I came to Canada, because when I grew up, everybody around me was African. So I saw myself as an African immigrant, not a Black person. But as time went on, I started to notice that in Canada, in this context, people do see me as Black, because without actually speaking to me or knowing anything about me, just looking at what's on the surface, I could look like any other Black person in Canada. I did have privileges, and I think also was able to adapt and navigate a variety of systems, which allowed me to succeed. I mean, you can hear the way I speak, you probably wouldn't know that I was born and raised in Nigeria, and that's one of those little privileges that I had no control over, but I think offered me more opportunities than I would have had otherwise. So I'm acutely aware of that. And then when I got to medical school, I was the only Black student in my class, and I would say in my life, that was the time that I was most aware of my Blackness, because you're looking around and there's 288 students and you're the only Black student. That pushed me to be a little bit more curious about the society that we live in and medical education as a whole. There's a quote by James Baldwin that speaks of education, that when one becomes conscious, they begin to examine the society that they are being educated in. And that's exactly what happened to me. So that's sort of what led me down my path of, well, let's talk about Blackness in medicine. And that's why I'm here today.
Thank you so much, GB, for that look. And I would like to go to Donneil and Michael also to elaborate on that. But I have in mind a very interesting quote by Dr. Ali Abdi and Ratna Ghosh. Both of them are two famous scholars in the area of race and racism and anti-racism, particularly in education. And they say, identity is influenced by one's location in relation to others and the way others identify and define us. How does this resonate with you, Donneil, from your experience, from your lived experience, from the way you are positioned in multiple locations, coming from Jamaica and becoming here as part of the Canadian, community? Yes, please.
Thanks, Neila, for that very relevant quote. And I think many of what was said earlier by my colleagues, I do also resonate with. As somebody who came here to Canada a few years ago from Jamaica, I came from a country that's predominantly Black. Our motto is out of many, one people. So we do tend to have some diversity in Jamaica, but for the most part, you have individuals who identify as Black. And within that, maybe the differences would be different levels as far as socioeconomic status is concerned, etc. So I was aware of those differences, but I was never aware of the fact that I could potentially be a minority based on my race. Not until I came to Canada. Came to Canada to pursue my studies. I was very excited when I came to Canada, but then slowly that excitement started to wane as I started to integrate within the Canadian society, and finding that in some spaces I had to assimilate and not necessarily be who I was when I came from Jamaica, but trying to integrate into this society to try to see if maybe folks would think I'd belong a little bit more. But regardless, I was always hyper aware of me being a Black individual and what that meant in the Canadian context, that I was seen as marginalized and from an underrepresented group. And then the systemic barriers that do exist within the Canadian context are things that I was pushed up against. And in some cases was a disadvantage for me. Perhaps it impacted how I showed up in certain spaces. There are opportunities that I missed because of that. So I think at that point in time is when I became aware of the fact that I am a Black individual and what that means. And you know, just showing up, even for example, just going to the mall and walking in a store and being followed all the time. Every time you go into a store after that, you're like, maybe I should purchase something so they don't think I'm stealing. Or you go into a store or a restaurant and somebody comes up to you, they don't know anything about you. And in my experience, they start to touch my hair because I am visibly different. My hair is different. For many people, their hair growing this way, my hair goes up, and for them, that's intriguing. So they start to touch your hair, which for me is never something I had to encounter growing up, because we all had similar hair back in Jamaica. So it wasn't something that was different. I remember once being in a restaurant just having dinner and having somebody just walk up to me randomly and grab my hair and say, wow, your hair looks so different. And I was taken aback. I was not sure how to respond to that, because then I was also very aware of the fact that depending on how I react, I would be seen as an angry Black woman. And not wanting to be seen as that person and be put into that box, I tried as best as possible to make it a teachable moment. But sometimes those teachable moments do get exhausting. It's like there's a video that likens microaggressions and stereotypes to mosquito bites. If you're somebody who you're bitten every once in a while, it may irritate your skin and you may be a tad annoyed. But in a few hours, a few days, you go back to being you. It doesn't bother you anymore, as opposed to somebody who is constantly getting bitten by mosquitoes. It is frustrating. It is something that you can't escape. If you take it back to reality and talk about constantly being in positions where you experience discrimination or stereotypes, then it is something that always follows you. As opposed to somebody who may come to this space, you may hear my experience, you may feel bad that I have to go through it, but you get to walk away. After this, I don't get to walk away. This is something that follows me as a Black individual. So I think that's something I did not experience back in Jamaica, but I've experienced here in Canada. And for that reason, I'm very much aware that I'm a minority and I'm very different from the majority.
Thank you so much, Donneil. Thank you for the maybe the hard truths, but the beautiful resistance that we can all, experiences within space, that we are at the same time trying to get in, to have access to, but also it keeps pushing, people to the margins and to be at the periphery. Michael, I am sure when we had started that, also your experience is quite different, similar, and which enhances that differentiated experiences of Black folks in BC and in Canada. We are all listening to you.
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in such a diverse and accomplished panel. My colleagues, I think that a lot of the experiences that have already been characterized, including the direct experience of interpersonal racism, of microaggressions throughout our country, and also these different experiences of Black, important to discuss. People who are born in Canada and outside, people who are coded or read.
I think there is an issue with Michael's connection.
Hello, I'm still here.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Yes, please, Michael.
Excellent. Well, I was just noting the strength and that diversity. I hope that a little bit of that came through before I was cut off there, just by the technology, it seems. One thing that I wanted to share when you asked Neila about identities, I think that identity, family, and ancestry can be so important to identity, and I appreciated the opportunity that you gave me to share my screen for a moment with just a couple of pictures that I thought might be interesting to me and maybe to the audience, and I think might inform part of the discussion that we have going forward. So I'm just going to put this into presentation mode. And those of you who are familiar with Montreal might be familiar with this building here. It's the McDonald Engineering Building at McGill University. And you'll see in the front row left there, a young man, one of two Black men, or two, I'd say, clearly Black men in this photograph. And this is the School of Engineering at the time at McGill. And this is the photo of my own grandfather. Really helped me to, I think about how we experience interpersonal racism, and how we, as we move through different spaces, whether in education or our professional lives, might also become more and more aware of systemic racism. That Montreal was a gloriously diverse community. Certainly was in the 1940s when this photograph was taken. And yet we see a stark underrepresentation of, I'll note an underrepresentation of women as well, and that's another conversation, a very important one, but a very, clear underrepresentation of Black people in this class. And I think something that's very important for our discussions as we go into this hour is how different is this photograph from over 75 years ago from a photograph of most medical schools in Canada right now. I actually was one of 2 people in a class of 100 in my own medical school when I went through. GB came through almost 15 years after me. It was the only Black medical student in his class. And I think that we really need to look at very closely over time while we talk. Well, I think we've become more and more aware of interpersonal racism, and I think we've seen amazing changes in how we might experience that or be able to call it out or to address that on an individual basis. Still stark systemic racism in so many of our institutions, and one of them that we all participate in is of course the enterprise of medicine and healthcare in Canada. So this is just something that I wanted to add just from my own personal family history.
Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing these personal, intimate details about your experience and your family and how it is so important that we center that around the conversations that we are talking, not about individual racism. It's not about being seen, get good people and bad people. We are talking here about systems of marginalization and oppression that have led to a point that we are in a place where, for example, we can see just one Black student, or when we don't have, for example, any Black leader in certain departments, or when we don't have any Black, senior representative. So representation is very important. And when we talked last time, we wanted to talk that not only the identity becomes part of the daily burdens that you carry with you wherever you go, as Donneil mentioned. There are other burdens that Black folks walk with every day: tokenization, representation, the burden to educate not only themselves, but also the people around them. How do you leave these types of extra burdens that Black folks carry every day without even, the rest of us can even notice? Yes, Felix?
Just as quickly, I think Michael has really hit the nail on the head. And I am very, very anxious, I don't know how else to put it, that my experience is not taken from this and generalized, because it is not the general experience. And that has to be very, very clear. I think I'm going to go off a little bit of a tangent. I think this weekend, for instance, where the first time in NFL history, 2 Black quarterbacks were in charge and playing for the Super Bowl. And I grew up at the time with an interest in sports where it was said that Blacks did not have the intelligence to call all these complicated plays. They could run, they can catch the ball, but when it really gets to the point where they have to think and organize plays and control it, they couldn't. And now that has been exploded. I also grew up at a time, even in the Olympic movement, where it was said, these Blacks, I guess it's in their genes, they run from lions and tigers, and that's why they could win the 100 meters, the 200 meters, and 400. But once you get beyond that, they're not disciplined. They cannot train long enough to win distance races. And of course, we now know that you cannot find a long distance race in which a Black person isn't either first, second, third, or whatever, or all 3. The point I'm laboring to make is the burden on us and the Faculty of Medicine is to carry the message to Black people that you see me, you can be me. And I think that conspicuousness whereby they see Black faces is what is going to lead to identification. And that's what's happened with the Indigenous story. So I just want to be very, very careful that the head of the division of neurosurgery is an anomaly. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the country, has not existed, and is likely not going to exist for the foreseeable future unless people see that that in fact is what they can do. And that's the message this panel needs to get out. We are not exceptional. We happen to be lucky.
GB?
Thanks very much. Thanks, Felix, for that. Just reflecting on your question there, Neila, it's I would like folks to just take a moment and put yourselves in my shoes as a student coming in first year. So I get in, I look around, all right, I'm the only one. And as Felix said, you know, we are an anomaly in a sense because the cards are stacked against us. There's a reason why between 1950 and when I got into medical school, only about 33 Black doctors graduated from UBC. And I did that count. I went around and counted the photos myself. So the cards are stacked against us and we make it into these spaces. That's not the end of the story though, because, you know, when I got in, immediately I started to feel like an actual imposter. Everyone talks about imposter syndrome as something that, you know, Black folks feel or women feel in professional settings, but I felt like an actual imposter because I was the only one. The question was, why did I make it? What was so special about me, first of all, that I made it? And then on the other hand, it's also, I'm here now. I don't want people to discover me as an imposter. So there's a lot of that sort of pressure and isolation on me as I'm trying to do the very, very hard work of being a medical student. I remember in my very first week, a TA came up to me, very well-meaning Black TA, and said, a teaching assistant, said, you know, I'm really happy to see you here, but just be aware that all eyes are going to be on you. And I think he meant that in a way to encourage me to do my best, but it did put a lot of pressure on me. And that's something that a lot of Black folks in medicine feel. It's, we are here, we are kind of representing our race, I guess, and our communities are expecting us to succeed. So the pressure is not only coming from outside of medical school, it's also coming from within medical school as well. Then in medical school, there's this hypervisibility that you feel, especially when anything related to race or Blackness comes up in the curriculum, because you're expected to speak on it, or people are wondering if you're going to speak on it and disturb the peace. And then there's also the invisibility. You don't see yourself represented as well. And so it's a very, very weird place to be mentally. And then I'm not even talking about the things that often always happen, the microaggressions, the micro-invalidations that people often do and say without realizing the impact that they're having on you, because they're kind of throwaway comments, but they don't realize that they're saying it because of how they've been conditioned to view Black people. And then, of course, systemically, lack of support. That was something I felt in first year, because there wasn't, you know, Donneil, who's here now, which is excellent, and I'm happy for the students who are coming in, but we didn't have a Donneil. And yeah, and then eventually that forced me to shift my focus oftentimes from the academic and professional goals that every other medical student was looking at to looking at this issue of Blackness in medicine. So I'm kind of wearing multiple hats in addition to just being a medical student. So that's just a snapshot of my experience in first year. And to answer your question about some of the burdens that we have to carry, we can't just be in a space. It's a constant negotiation with how are people viewing me and what is my role to play here.
Thank you so much, GB, because now I'm going to ask Tatiana and Donneil, particularly centering here Crenshaw, intersectionality, centering here the experiences that the layers of marginalizations are in, you know, the intersections of race, gender, sexual orientation, faith. I personally did my research, my PhD research with the Black Muslim youth and the experiences, the layers of marginalization as multiple in terms of how you are positions in the spaces you are in. What do you think, Tatiana, how that these intersections adds to the questions that Black women need to take care? Should they be perfect all the time? As mentioned Donneil earlier, I think that Black and brown and women of color should really tame their energy to be angry in order to be, oh, you know, we are not the angry Black women. How does this manifest in your daily experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a great resilience that comes from having to stick handle, for lack of a better Canadiana term, around these situations. But, you know, I think one of the things that I experience is a certain kind of discongruence. So, you know, I would say I would get mistaken for a nurse or an allied healthcare provider. And then when I would say I'm a physician and I was a pediatrician, they would say, oh yes, well, that makes sense because you know how Black women, they've always been nurturers. So yeah, of course you would work with babies. And then, you know, but on the other hand, if there's a situation in which I'm more emphatic or I raise my voice, then all of a sudden I'm suddenly very intimidated in all of my 5'3" of height, you know? So, and I'm very conscious of this constant adjustment. And some of it comes from what GB alluded to about when I walk into a room, I'm conscious of not only representing myself, but a community at large. And I feel in my work, supporting and trying to mentor the next generation of medical learners, that my experience, even though I have intersections that may at some points be viewed as marginalized, I have a very different experience than, say, my colleagues who are male appearing. And I tend to not reflexively elicit reactions of fear, but I hear that a lot from trainees that I'm trying to support who are young men. And most dishearteningly, I hear it from my patients, even the patients who want to consider healthcare careers or want to consider medicine as something that they would potentially explore. And this certain sense of being lost and not fitting in any world, you know, especially you alluded to the young Black Muslim youth that you work with. And, you know, I've worked with several of these youth and they're incredibly resilient, but they'll say to me often, like, you know, like, I feel like I'm not going to fit into that world, but I feel like I don't really fit in the larger Canadian society because I'm always being asked like where I'm from, but where I'm from, they don't feel like I'm one of them either, or my experience is quite different and quite unique. So I think that the messaging for me is to be open to my own unique experience of intersectionality, informing empathy to the experience that others might have that might be even more complex than my own experience. And I think for that, it takes a definite amount of time and empathy and an openness to hear about some of the you know, gaps in our systems and even within our communities. And I mean that in a large sense and in more of a microcosm as well.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. Donneil, I am sure that the daily experiences of, you know, the play of inclusion, exclusion is part of the daily, you know, survival tools that I'm sure that IBPOC go through, and particularly now when we're talking about Black women, how do you see this kind of, you know, challenges, burdens, how you carry them, how you move with them, how you navigated the different spaces and locations you are positioned in?
Yeah, I think when we talk about intersectionality, it's particularly in my instance as a Black woman, you're talking about showing up as a woman and having those disadvantages because you are a woman, showing up as being Black and also having those disadvantages. And they're not one and the same, but you can't view them differently. They all compound to kind of shape the experiences that you have as an individual going through this lifetime, especially say in the Canadian context. I found that, you know, we grew up hearing about the glass ceiling and how having a glass ceiling tends to hold women down, and they can only go to a certain level in an organization or within a field in particular. And for me, it feels more of the term that they use nowadays, a concrete ceiling. I think with a glass ceiling, you know, it's a little, you can break it. It will take some effort depending on the glass, but you can break it. And it's clear, so you can see, you can feel inspired, you can see the top, and you know that there's a potential for you to somewhat be able to climb to the top, as opposed to a concrete where it's very hard. You can't see what's on the other side. It takes more than one to be able to crack that concrete, and it takes significant effort to be able to push through that concrete. It's not something that we can do on our own as Black women. And that's where that systemic piece comes in, and even just that concept of community and supporting each other. And another term that is being used nowadays is allyship. How can you use your privilege to be able to support those who are a little bit less privileged than you are? And I find that for me, a lot of times, because of this how things are with being that intersectionality of being a Black woman, you walk into a space or you walk into a room and you're the only Black woman there. And maybe for some people that's an achievement or an accomplishment, but for me, it's an indication that something is very wrong in that space. I don't want to be the only Black person at that table. I don't want to be the only Black voice at a table, because the reality is my experiences differ from another Black individual, from another Black woman, depending on where you're from, what your experiences have been moving through life. Maybe there are other intersectionalities because you have a disability, you're a part of the 2S LGBTQIA+ community. If I'm not a part of those communities, I can't speak on behalf of those individuals. So why don't we have more people at the table? And for me, it's focusing more on the future and being a forward thinker. And when I do get to some of these tables and I do get into some of these spaces, how can I prop that door open for other people to be able to come into that space so I can see even more representation? How can I, if I'm climbing the ladder, how can I reach back and help somebody else to climb the ladder as well, is how I try to look at it. There are many challenges that we go through as Black people and also as Black women, and I try as best as possible to not, obviously it does impact me as a person going through this world, but I try not to focus too much on that. But how can I, perhaps what I'm doing now in my current role is help to open some of those doors, help to break down some of those barriers. As somebody who tries to advocate for people in my community, making sure that I'm walking the talk and have other people do that as well. Because many people are well-intentioned and they say they want to see representation, but let's even talk about a context of the Faculty of Medicine and having more Black students come into the Faculty of Medicine. And for me, more Black women who will be physicians in the future. It's not just about increasing those numbers and being able to see more Black students in those cohort pictures. It's more so about what you do when you get those students through the door. It's one thing to increase representation, but we want to make sure that there is continuity in support. So you don't want to have significant support on the front end when we're trying to recruit people and bring them into med school. And then people come in and then they have these intersectionalities as well, and they find themselves encountering challenges. GB talked about imposter syndrome earlier. That is something that they will always have regardless. So how are you supporting people at that point with mentorship opportunities, etc.? I think is very important, because that's how we're going to be able to support those who we are bringing to these spaces and making sure that we're not causing further harm, because it's pointless to me to say increase representation if that support is not there. And the support is needed, particularly in the faculty. And we have started, we're getting somewhere, because I'm here. We have a pathway for folks to be able to come through that pathway. But as we continue to improve, the onus will be on us as people who have these positions, have access to resources, is to make sure that those are also filtering down to the students that we're bringing into this space.
Thank you, Donneil. You just started, even touching on what we're going to be engaging with. So, Tatiana, I see your hand, and please, your input is extremely important in these conversations. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think not to forget also the patient view of this. What I have encountered and experienced is that when there comes time to raise issues of, disproportionate effects of, say, COVID or other pathologies, whether it be in maternal or child health, that often people say, well, you know, we're not the US, so it probably doesn't apply. But there is a dearth of research disaggregate data that would allow us to confer with that, you know, general comment. So we're not sure. And I think as I've become more aware of how embedded some of this anti-Blackness is into the foundation, the very tools that we use to diagnose and triage, I've become aware of just how deep it is. But more shockingly, I've become aware of a long-standing body of evidence that has been cautioning us about these things that I was never really informed about, or that my peers were never educated on during our medical training. And it's not just yesterday that we've been finding these issues out. And so there's been academic medical scholars that have been cautioning about these things and thinking about these things for a long time. And so the onus is on us as well within our system to bring that body of knowledge into the mainstream of the academics, for which standards for which we expect all of our students to be graduating with. And I think that could help hugely with the onus only being on individuals that look like those who are on the panel here today.
Thank you so much, because this is the conversation that we would like to frame in terms of highlighting the heterogeneity of your experiences, but also the challenges, that each one of you is facing in different ways. But also you pointed something extremely important. Representation shouldn't be tokenistic. It shouldn't be to a check, check the box. It shouldn't be about anything that has only with the color. And that's why I'm addressing Michael. How do you navigate these issues, and what do you think about these challenges that Black people and Black folks are encountering?
Again, I just want to thank my colleagues. I think Donneil really apt metaphors. The idea is looking at a glass or even concrete ceiling, the idea of trying to splatter that one has come up. I think that a lot of these the experiences that we're hearing and these descriptions do point to the importance to address equity and to address inclusion along with diversity and representation. That the one is definitely not going to go far enough. It's necessary, but not sufficient. We had a chance to talk, some of us, before this panel, and a few of us shared the experience of having patients as trainees or even as practitioners refuse to engage with us, refuse to see us. And the vulnerable position that one is in as a medical student or as a resident trainee, trying to learn, trying to also engage in service to a hospital system and to our communities. And this is disheartening that this is such a common experience among Black people in our healthcare system. And I think that what a lot of the general public might find more surprising than that, though, is the common experience of some of our supervisory colleagues, residents, staff physicians in those situations, not really supporting us. In fact, saying, what would be easier is if you just didn't see that patient, and going along with that request or that demand in some cases. The questions that we have when you start to ask as a trainee, why is my learning, why is my training dependent on somebody else's interpersonal racism? Why am I being limited in the experiences I'm going to have? And furthermore, why are other patients, the physician or the medical student or resident, they see being shaped by the remaining students or trainees who someone else hasn't refused, who've already been refused? That's, of course, this is wrong. And again, this is why, to Dr. Durity's point early on, the idea of having faces that reflect the diversity of our populations in leadership roles in our institutions, medical schools and hospitals and so on, is really crucial. I think that if we're going to have a place to turn when we experience racism that's at an interpersonal level or at a systemic level, it's really crucial that we have the inclusion of people that reflect our communities in all of these different roles. if we're going to see an improved experience. And again, I think all of my colleagues put it really well. It's not just about improving the numbers, the counts or the percentages of people from one group or another, but their genuine participation, their genuine inclusion in the systems that they're being brought into is really crucial.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that point that it's about the genuinity, the commitment, the real, commitment that real changes need to happen. It's not about changing attitudes of individuals, but we need to go to policies, to institutions, to systems of oppression that have established that system that has always put Black people on the side, on mostly, IBPOC on the side. My question is also emanating, I have a question that I want to address to you, and you mentioned it here, that when we navigate these spaces, because of the lack of representation, not only around the racial representation, but also around, even when we have Black people, we need to have Black people with different experiences. We need to have Black people coming from different cultural backgrounds, etc. My concern is about Black youth born and raised in Canada. I still have a segment from my own research. When I interviewed Ali, who was a Black student, he said, I was always the bad boy, the troublemaker, and always accused of all the wrong things. I was born and raised in Canada. I only speak English. I have no other language. I have no other place. Every day, I am told, go back to where you belong. Where shall I go? I have no other place but this place. But every day, I feel suffocated, excluded, accused. A disheartening statement that is haunting me until now. What can we do to open these spaces of hope, of possibilities, opportunities to these young people to dream one day to be in positions like yours? Felix.
This is where my heart really gets almost drained of all its blood, because it gets me passionate. I almost want to say annoyed. And so, as I said, and deep, deep respect to what you are doing and what Rosalind is doing and the experiences that I feel so humbled with this panel, is I think the Faculty of Medicine, the University of British Columbia, has to see itself as a social entity and not just a purveyor of medical science. The faculty, the student body needs to get to look like the society in which it lives. And so it's a major, major obligation, I would call it, on the Faculty of Medicine, and Rosalind can speak to this, to have a major outreach program. And I know that they go now and they speak to K8, I think through to 10 or 11, to make them aware of the excitement that there is in medicine, etc., etc. And I will be biased enough to say that that kind of outreach ought to be targeted to Black students. I mentioned to you off the record, I am part of a group working with a lady, and Ruki and I presented last year in the Department of Geography, and she has a Black Students Initiative. And they come in once a month. She brings them in all the way from Chilliwack, and I've talked to them. You're talking about 150 students, to let them be aware of the opportunities in secondary education that they weren't aware about, and that they should see themselves as being able to achieve. And that's why I say, see me, be me, that we are not exceptional. So there has to be a major outreach program. And I'm going to be kicked in the head here when I said I get a little upset about this BIPOC term. I've mentioned that to you, because even within that group, Blacks are the most disadvantaged and the most underrepresented. And I don't deny anything that's going on, they deserve it. But I think it's even a reflection of the situation where now we don't talk about BIPOC anymore, we talk about IBPOC. It's been a very subtle, it's like, sort of like when doctors stop talking about patients and start using the word clients. So I think the faculty needs, and Donneil has talked about it, and Tatiana has talked about it, to have a vigorous ambassadorial and outreach program. They need to ally with those people who even target where the problem exists. And so I think that they need to create within the Faculty of Medicine spaces. They've done this in the Faculty of Law, I'm familiar with it, where Black people can get together, provide a support system for each other, not to silo, but to come together and provide the kind of supports that Donneil said they need. You know, it's not just getting into medical school, but setting them up to succeed. And that, I have to stop because I can go on, and that involves not just social support, it means financial support. I graduated in fourth year medicine. I was at the top of my class for the first 2 years. I dropped out in third year for financial reasons. I graduated at the end of fourth year medicine with $5 in the bank, a wife, and a kid. We need to protect these students because that's a common story, not limited to Blacks, but in my class, I was the only one. And so I think there's a support system that the faculty has. It's a big umbrella and they have to open it, but they need a specific and targeted focus. And I'll stop there. You're muted, Neila.
Yeah, thank you so much, Felix. It's always so impressive to hear your wisdom, your experience, your commitment, that strong dedication to that cause of Black people. And we talked, in other circumstances, and I think that this is a vision that we need to build up. It's a movement that has to have a ripple effect on, in the faculty and beyond. Tatiana.
Yeah, thanks. I think in addition to what Dr. Durity has laid out so well is, I see allies in my clinic every week, sometimes every day. And what I would say to Ali is be there, not at the cost of your own mental health, which some of us who have been doing this kind of work have been, but you do deserve to be there. But what I would also argue is the deeper thing that we need to do as Ali's elders and as those who are in academia is to communicate with his teachers and to be that translational knowledge bearer with educators and say, listen, there is a disproportionate number of Alis that are suspended for equal offenses that other people that don't look like Ali are not. And can we look at the structures within even education that maybe disqualifying kids very early on and disengaging them? And how can we help the Alis of the world feel supported, seen, heard, and remain in the education system and engaged and seen and heard, so that when it comes to time for them to apply to the medical school, they haven't been lost way far down the pipeline. And so I think that's what we can do as academics. And I think that is my responsibility as a pediatrician and as someone who, has dedicated, my academic work to working with you.
Thank you so much, because you are now, getting into a space that is deep in my heart. I'm an educator. My work, my research, my commitment is around how we can center, the experiences of these underrepresented, equity-deserving groups, and particularly how we can transform education. Transform education is essential in this process, and particularly the earlier, the better. We cannot wait until people are choosing for their, university degrees, because I did research with people that even university is not even something they are even thinking about, because they have always didn't see a role model of their color, didn't see a member of the family, going through that stage, didn't see any options. I tell you something that must be grim, because we want to end the session on hope, but there is a reality. Statistics in education shows that Black youth, especially males, are disproportionately represented in suspension, expulsion, exclusion, and streaming. Maybe we cannot believe it, and we don't want to believe it. Until recently, this is from an article 2020, Canadian schools use it to celebrate Slave Day. Disheartened to see certain lack of data. GB, he counted the graduates of medical school. I always say, we cannot change what we don't see. We need to see numbers, we need to see experiences, we need to see people, we need to be accountable of how far have we come so far. I'm a hopeful person, and I believe in your power in changing. How can we cultivate a culture of belonging? Because I think that belonging is a superior value to our existence within our communities. Because I quote here Floya Antheus, belonging is not just about membership, rights, and duties, as in the case of citizenship, or just but forms of identifications with groups or others. It is all about the social places constructed by such identification and membership, and the ways in which social place has resonance on stability of the self, on feelings of being part of a larger whole, and the emotional and social bonds that are related to such place. My question to you, each one of you, I'm expecting, how can we create and cultivate a culture of belonging from your Black positionality for also the Black people? GB?
Yeah, thanks, Neila. I appreciate the hope that you have. I have to say I'm a little bit more skeptical of the hope, because I feel already that we are in a period of backlash. We're seeing it all over the news, people just getting more and more upset with marginalized folks and pushing back in a very, very, very bad way. And I think that the Faculty of Medicine has its work cut out for it, because I think with the implementation of this Black student application stream, you might start seeing some of that backlash, not only within the faculty or from people outside of the faculty. You will probably see it from students themselves. I had a colleague who is in medical school recently share with me how one of their classmates was like, yeah, I don't know why you keep talking about the systemic racism thing. It does not exist. These are people who are going to be physicians, okay? So there has to be intentionality around, we talk about belonging, around educating the people who are going to be the decision makers in medicine in the future, who are going to be the physicians, around these issues, but really educating them in a way that they can see the facts for themselves. It's undeniable. We can't just talk big words. We have to really, really show how there are direct linkages with the history and what we're seeing today in medical education, what we're seeing today in health outcomes. People have already mentioned things like racist medicine, EGFR calculations that are specific to Black people. We're teaching that to students, and students are not questioning it. We're not teaching the students to be critical of the system that they're being educated in, and that needs to change, because these are the people who are going to be making the decisions in the future. So I want to be hopeful that we are heading in the right direction, and I believe we are, but I have to be also very, very cautious in making sure we're paying attention, really paying attention to what's going on around us, because we are in for some potentially tough times, unfortunately, I have to say.
Thank you so much. You pointed something really important, because many people have reported that certain reactions, an increase in that sense of discomfort has appeared, even with the established, for example, of the Anti-Racism Task Force. So we will need all to be aware that with the hope, we need to know also we have accountability, and we have a sense of the presence that this is something that's not going to be solved, soon. It requires constant work from everybody. How can we have Donneil, Tatiana, Michael, how can we move forward with cultivating a culture of belonging and addressing these systemic racism, systemic challenges, not only in medical school or healthcare, but even beyond?
Well, I think I'm really glad that the example was raised of the new admission pathway. I think that it's absolutely crucial, and it points to the issue of seeing more within our medical school programs. However, it's very, very important not to fragment these efforts. I think that we sometimes risk when we talk about these single programs, like for example, an admissions program, we're talking about the middle pylon of a bridge perhaps, which is a very important pylon, but it's not the whole pathway. So we need to think about not just how people move from, say, undergraduate education or their work lives into medical school, but how are they supported into their transition to practice? How are they supported getting into positions of leadership that are visible to trainees, to young people, to indeed to children? And then in the pathways before that, how do we even get to that bridge, getting people into medicine? These issues that were brought up around early childhood experiences, school experiences, streaming, differential discipline that children are experiencing, financial support, and other pathways that help to alleviate the effects of systemic racism are so crucial. So we need to think of this entire pathway, I think, and not just the individual components. And one way that we can do that, and I really see all of the panel here doing so, and in fact the titling and the very philosophy of this session is that we do need to name systemic racism as the issue, and we do need to name anti-racism as the goal, and in fact the movement. And when we do that, I think that we unify these different efforts and we bring a coherence to it so that we don't get discouraged, and we actually are able to find solidarity with all of the different elements along this pathway, whether we're talking about differential rates of suspension and expulsion among 10-year-old students in the school system, or we're talking about differential access to leadership positions at the most senior levels of medicine. I think that when we see the overall issue, we can find and draw on successes and also learn from challenges right across that spectrum. And I think that that's really crucial when we're talking about, as we are, diversity, equity, and inclusion in medicine, is there's no single pathway, no single measure that we can esteem over all of the others, because they all interact and they all support one another.
Thank you so much, Michael. Donneil, as we are speaking about this initiative and this pathway and how it can change certain lives, opportunities, and I'm sure that we need to give a credit to the Black physicians of BC. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Durity, because I think they are the power and the advocates who started, advocating for such a pathway. How does this initiative, Donneil, how do you see it? How do you think that what kind of resources should be allocated to that initiative? What kind of, what vision is going to also protect this initiative and to make it really impactful, not only, for the optics, but to have real impact on the lives and the opportunities and the chances of Black students who's going to join Faculty of Medicine?
Yeah, thanks, Neila. So I think having the pathway is certainly a good start. It's an indication that we are working towards breaking down some of these barriers that our Black medical students have been facing, or even prospective applicants who haven't even been able to get through the door in the first place. But I think in order for this program to thrive and not just survive, or even survive, there needs to be a paradigm shift. We are trying to have these initiatives and these programs in systems that are inherently oppressive. And if we don't address that, then these programs will not be able to thrive. So when you think about the curriculums that we have in schools that students, or even within this program, is it reflective of people who are going to be coming into these programs is something that we need to think about. Who do we have in the classroom with these students? Do we have representation among staff? Do we have representation among faculty? These are things that we also need to consider in order for the program to thrive. So it's not just about getting them into the system, trying to get them to succeed and get them out. There are many things and many facets that we have to touch on in order for that to be able to happen. On top of that, resources are pertinent. Financial resources, of course, being one, but people is another one that we need to think about. So I'm here right now. I'm hoping that in the future, as we continue to grow the number of students through the pathway, is that we will have more people devoted to doing this work, who identify with the students who are coming through the pathway. Because the reality is, if you have staff and faculty supporting these students, and the staff and the faculty are feeling burnt out, they're not going to be able to serve the students. I tell everybody, you cannot pour from an empty cup. And if there isn't also support for staff and faculty who are in these spaces that are very, very emotionally taxing, they will not be able to support the students in the way they should be supporting the students. So we also have to look at that facet of having a program like this and having multiple stakeholders involved. So what are you doing for your staff? Do we have enough staff for us to be able to have a community to bounce ideas off of each other, to even just be there? Because sometimes you just want to talk about things and vent, because let's be honest, we're operating in a bureaucracy, and sometimes you're going to get pushback. And sometimes things are going to be a little bit slower than you're hoping for it to be. And that can cause some frustration, but sometimes having people to, like, for example, having a colleague or somebody to talk to about those things can help to just ground you and resituate you in order to keep going and advocating for those who you are advocating for. So I think, again, it's a start just having the pathway, but we have to make sure that, as I said before, we are walking the talk. It can't just be for show to say, hey, we have a Black pathway, and now we have increased the students 300%. That's not enough. We have to make sure that we are supporting on all facets, because otherwise we're going to have people going through the system who are also experiencing burnout, experiencing imposter syndrome, and they take that into their careers, and then the problems just continue from there. Also, it's not just about UGME and what happens in undergrad. What are we doing at the PGME level? How are we making sure that we are not operating in silos, but doing things collaboratively and cohesively? Because the reality is, once they leave undergrad, they're going to be going into residency, and we can't have things break down at that point. The support has to continue. So it really is a very, very big venture, but it's realistic. It's one that we can achieve. We just have to ensure that we're not looking at it as a destination, but rather a journey. It's not something that we're going to say, hey, now we have solved all EDI issues. I don't know if that will ever happen, but we can certainly move the needle, and not just a little bit, significantly, to ensure that we're supporting people in the way that they need to be supported who are coming from underrepresented groups.
Thank you, Donneil. What can I add to that, beautiful and meaningful and very informative suggestion to move forward with that? As I promised the audience that you will open the space for them to ask you questions, because you are here, the experts, you are here, the people who need also to share with audience all these kind of challenges and also the hopes. What I need to end with from my part here is that a quote by Bell Hooks. And how can we talk about Blackness without centering Bell Hooks in terms of, she says, what has become clear is that education for critical consciousness, coupled with anti-racist activism that works to change all our thinking so that we construct identity and community on the basis of openness, shared struggle, and inclusive working together, offer us the continued possibility of eradicating racism. I'm quoting Bell Hooks from Belonging: A Cultural Place. Maybe she's so hopeful to say eradicating, but I would say, let's even try, all of us in this space, to do the minimum. I open the possibilities and the opportunities for the audience to ask questions to the panel.